Hi, welcome to the AfterAthena podcast. My name's Jade McAvoy. I'm a HR consultant here at AfterAthena. I'm joined today by Natalie Parkinson, Head of Employment Litigation. And today we're going to be discussing extra incomes and how more employees have got an additional source of income known as a side hustle. We're really going to be looking at what constitutes a side hustle, how can it impact a business, and what businesses can do if to avoid any negative repercussions of employees having a side hustle. Um, so Natalie, how would you describe a side hustle?
I think really when we're talking about side hustles in the employment relationship context, we're talking about anything really that an employee or a worker does to earn extra money outside of their main job role.
Mm.
That can manifest in a number of ways. It could be an employee working in a bar of a weekend. It could be increasingly, in terms of the modern world that we are, online presences. So whether someone has a YouTube site or an Instagram page where they're using that to generate funds, or just generally social media following. And then, sort of alongside all of that, we could also be looking at somebody using their main job role and the experiences and skill set that they have there to generate an income away from the main role that they have with you.
Mhm. Yeah, and it is happening more and more. And I think, especially with the rise of social media, we are seeing those platforms being utilised for people. And when we think about the cost of living crisis, which we're going to touch more on, it's understanding why those free platforms are being used to um, support people, I guess, with these additional lines of income when we're thinking about the cost of living crisis. What can employees and employers do in that scenario then if employers are finding out that employees have got a second source of income?
Yeah, I think actually this is it's nothing new. I think, we've had it, historically where employees have always had second jobs.
Mm.
I don't think that in itself is new, but as you say, in terms of the cost of living crisis, but also just in terms of the modern world generally, I think that we're seeing a shift in employee mindset to become that little bit more entrepreneurial and to think about other ways to generate money and to help bolster lifestyles really. We see sort of all the time on social media sort of an aspirational
Mm.
life that people want to live, and naturally to fund that, people need money. Um, and I think in terms of what an employer can do about that and sort of how that manifests, as an employment lawyer, we hear about it, yes, when employees come to us to say they've got that second job, but actually it starts way before then. For me, the employment contract, that's the bedrock of the relationship between employer and employee. So this is something that I think we've always had in our
Mm.
contemplation when we look at drafting those types of documents to manage that relationship. And so there might be something like an outside interest clause where we encourage employees to speak with us if they're going to have an outside interest or a second job role. Um, Things like that. That's nothing new, but it's sort of preempting what might happen if an employee comes to you and they do have that second job. I think the key, if we sort of skip ahead to us finding out about that second job, it's always interesting sort of how we find out that that second job is there. Um, if an employee comes to us and is talking to us about that second job, great, we can have an open discussion and we can understand more about it. We also see the flip side of that, though, where somebody might have a side hustle or a second job that is secret for whatever reason and then comes to light. So, this isn't really a straightforward issue in that we're just looking at somebody that's got a second job and they're using that to potentially just earn a little bit of extra money on the side. It is a really wide discussion. And I think certainly for me as an employment lawyer, looking at the modern workplace, this is something that clients more and more frequently are
Mhm.
coming to speak with us about. Um, Communication for me is absolutely key. So the minute that you are becoming aware that somebody has a second job, whether they've come to you and declared that, or whether it's something that you found out about via another means, we need to obviously have an open discussion with that employee to understand what the job is, why they're doing it, and what the reasons are. And that's really easy if someone comes to you and says, I've got a second job and is that okay? Or I'm planning to have a second job. We can easily have that open discussion. But in a scenario where perhaps it's brought to our attention alternatively, that obviously can be a little trickier and it might require the involvement of potentially HR or managers to investigate and understand exactly what the reasons for that are. Um, I think, in terms of communication, as I said, we want to understand the reasons. So, why is that employee looking to have that second source of income? And then, key to all of that is to understand how the employee and the business, because it's a two-way street, as
Mm.
an employment relationship is, would understand that job role as impacting upon the central role that they have with you. So if you have an employee that's coming to you and saying, do you know what, I really think that I need to have a second income stream. And because of that, I've secured a second role and I'm letting you know, then we'd want to understand the reasons for that.
Mm.
And if we see that that's going to potentially negatively impact us, there might be things that we can do around that. If this is an employee that actually you hadn't realised that they were struggling in that way, and there might be things that you can do to help. So, for example, is there overtime available?
Mm.
Um, could we look at, changing their hours of work to give them more hours of work? If they've got sort of a part-time contract, could we look to make that full-time? Um, to give you a personal example from sort of my career history, at one stage I had a temporary job role. So that meant that I worked alongside that to make sure that I could fund, my lifestyle. And I then had a discussion with my employer and managed to switch that temporary employment contract into a permanent employment contract so that I didn't then have that worry. So I think that, open dialogue is absolutely key. And it's about sort of understanding the reasons that sit behind potentially why that employee has felt the need to have that second job.
Yeah. Okay, and I think what you've said there about communication and keeping those lines of communication open, it is about that trust, and it is a two-way street, isn't it? And I guess that feeds into the culture and the sort of culture that we're breeding within the organisation and the open door policies that we've got. And as I said, that communication, and as you've mentioned, we do need employees to be coming to us and letting us know if they are struggling. But from a leadership level, it's making sure that people feel safe to have those conversations. Um, when do you think it does become an issue for the employer?
I think there are a number of ways it can be a problem for an employer. So, if somebody is working excessively outside of that main job role, if you've got somebody, for example, that's working 5 days for you in a
Mm.
typical full time 9 to 5 role,
Mm.
Monday to Friday, and then it transpires that they're also working on a Saturday and Sunday, are they having sufficient rest? Are they coming to work really able to give you their all? So at first, it might be the case that we're happy for them to have that second income stream. But if we then see that that's impacting upon their main and central role with us,
Mm.
then, that might be a problem for us. If they're sort of tired and unable to work to their full potential. The other area, again, that we see as employment lawyers is sort of the flip side of the employee coming to you openly with open hands and saying, either I'm looking to take on this second job or I have taken on a second job or business, where somebody might have kept that a secret. And it then transpires that they're using the skill set and training skills that they've gained from you to then generate a second income source. That might be fine. You might be happy with that. But if actually there's a crossover in terms of the work that you do and what they are doing elsewhere, then that might be a problem. So if you think of an example where, for example, somebody owns a bakery, and you have an employee that's come up with either a new product or a new flavour that sells really, really well. And then actually it transpires that on the side, they're selling that privately. Effectively, they're taking away your client base potentially, and we might not be happy about that.
Mm.
Um, so, I think that there's the side that we talked about initially where an employee is just doing this to earn a little bit of extra money, and they might just then be a little bit more tired at work and it's impacting their role in that way. But then, in terms of the business generally, there might be things that an employee is doing to generate that extra income. Not only is it impacting how that sole employee works in their role that they are employed to do for you, but it's impacting on the business as a wider concern. Because actually, are they taking your clients? Are they taking your customers? And is there then something that we need to do reputationally and fundamentally to protect the business? And I think that's when it can get a little bit trickier. And that's when you might start to think about things like intellectual property, and making sure that we've really protected that role and that skill set really. Yeah. Um, Again, in terms of employees that have got access within your business, all of our employees, to some extent, there's trust there. That's fundamental to the employment relationship. We know
Mm.
that. But depending on the role that an employee has within a business, they might have access to, for example, client databases, to information that would enable them to get retail items at cheaper cost. If they know, for example, what we're buying items for from a wholesaler, they might be able to use that to sort of to help themselves. So there's all of these things that an employee, as part of that employment relationship, gains from us, and we need to be able to trust them. So all of that is fundamental, really, and can obviously impact upon how that person performs for us. And it's when then that might cross over into it being a worry or a concern for us as an employer.
Yeah, thank you. Um, and I think that's it, isn't it? It's making sure that employees understand the reasoning as
Yeah,
well for that, because I think sometimes, and we've all been guilty of it, people fail to see the wider picture
yeah.
and why we're wanting to do things, and that it is there to protect the business and protect the reputation of the business. It's not because we're being nosy or we want to take over people's lives, or we're not dictating unnecessarily. So I think, as you've said, making sure that those policies are there, but also educating people so that they understand that that's the reason why,
Hmm.
that we're putting those clauses as well in contracts. I think is key, and just
Yeah,
keeping that communication and that
yeah.
trust really, really open.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other sort of area to this in terms of the modern workplace
Mm,
particularly, is that third sort of area that we we're talking about in terms of online presences.
mm,
If we think about somebody that might see it as easy to have, whether it's a YouTube site or an Instagram page or any of those social media type streams to try and generate
mm,
funds. That's a really modern challenge for employers to deal with. I've certainly had clients with employees that have got an online presence, and things have happened in the workplace that somebody is seen as a way to perhaps have a stunt or a prank, and that can go wrong. Um, I've had manufacturing type environments where employees have done something silly, recorded it, uploaded it to YouTube because they think it might go viral. There's obviously going to be problems there,
yeah.
potentially reputationally for the business, but also in terms of risks that are being taken.
Mm,
And that I think is a particularly modern challenge for employers to face. We've always had in the background this thing around sort of protecting clients, protecting customers, intellectual property. Where we were talking about sort of impact in terms of ability to fulfill that main job because you're too tired. That's always been the case. But the new spin on all of this is reputation, I think, in terms of, the World Wide Web.
yeah, in people's
If we
online
still call it
presence.
that, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
in this day and age. But yeah, I think that's a real key element of the modern workplace and a challenge for employers to navigate.
Mm,
Um, and really, it can be difficult sometimes for employers to really understand, what does having 20,000 followers on YouTube mean, and how might that impact upon a business.
mm,
And it's that crossover between the side hustle and that second job, and how that may impact upon not only the employee and their ability to fulfill their individual role, but the business as a whole. You might have an employee that you absolutely love, but they do something really silly to try and generate that bit of extra money. And, somebody or the public at large really take issue with that. And then we've got to take stock as to how feasible it is for that employee to carry on with us.
Mm. Yeah, and how you manage
Yeah,
that, and how you manage that reputational potential reputational damage
yeah,
as well.
absolutely.
If customers, clients, are seeing that in what impact that's potentially going to have on your business. Um, what should you do then if you think that it is impacting your business in a negative way?
Yeah, so I think the starting point with all of this is, open dialogue and discussion. We want to communicate with that employee to understand more about what it is that they're doing, and to sort of really take stock as to how we see it as impacting upon us, but also what do they think? How do they think their side hustle, their second job, is impacting upon their central role with us? Now, I'd imagine they're going to say either it benefits you or it's not impacted upon you. And it's for us as an employer, as part of that two-way street and that open discussion, to really, take note of that, but to reflect and to say, is that the case or not? And if it is impacting upon us and it is going to sort of be a challenge for us, then we need to understand what we can do to manage that. And to manage it, we go way back to where we started in this discussion, to that employment contract and our policies. And we want to really make sure that they are protecting the business in the way that we need them to, if and when this actually sort of gets a little bit out of hand and we need to almost either rein it in or have a very frank discussion with that employee to explain that, either this isn't all right, and we need to perhaps manage that. It's easy if an employee's come to you and has declared that and has asked for your permission. It's almost there for you to be able to say yes or no and to explain your reasons around that. If though somebody's kept this a secret from you, and particularly where we think there's an element of them taking things from the business to use to their own benefit or gain, then we really want to make sure that our contracts and our documentation backs that up. And I think not only from an employment contract, if you've got somebody that could really pose a risk to your business by way of a second business, um, even, we've seen it time and time again where somebody is employed by us and thinks, you know what, I could do this myself and make some more money, and start that side hustle that starts as a
Mm.
side hustle that then actually becomes quite successful. What do we do then? What do we do at that point in time? And for employees that are at that level that are going to have that access, that's that little bit more of a threat to us. Are we really protecting ourselves in terms of their employment contract and the policies and documentation that sit alongside that? Um, is it worth, for example, bringing in, a lawyer with intellectual property skills to make sure that, our contracts give us that correct level of protection, as and when it's needed? Um, I think that, is absolutely key.
Yeah, thank you. We've covered quite a lot there, exploring where it starts for people and in what um can seem quite innocent at face value, cost of living crisis. I feel like we're talking about every year. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere when you're thinking about increases to energy, food costs, travel costs. It's not surprising that more people are thinking of alternative ways to increase their income. Um, but obviously, with that, it's posing a potential risk
Yeah,
for employers, and I think what you've really honed in on is making sure that you're prepared for
yeah.
any eventualities should they
Yeah. I
arise.
think there's two sides to it. It's about preparation. So
Mm,
obviously we talked about the employment contract being the bedrock of that relationship and making sure that, there's that protection built in right from the start. But also it's about understanding, are you just giving that employee a contract and saying, sign it and give it me back? Or are we having actually an open discussion with people when they join our business and we onboard them so that they understand, if there is something that they need to bring to our attention or to discuss with us, How do they do that? Who do they communicate with? It's about making sure that that's there. Um, in terms of, the role that the employee has, have we made sure that we're protecting ourselves in terms of the access that they've got? So we're talking obviously there about things like intellectual property. We've obviously discussed that. Also, restrictive covenants. We want to make sure that they're really built in the right way. So if somebody is to leave you, maybe to set up on their own, something that started off as a side hustle and then, is successful. Are we protected in that regard? Are we sure that we understand exactly whether they're likely to be enforceable or not? And that requires very careful drafting. And we need to make sure they're tailored in the right way. But I think the other side of all of this is that communication piece. Communication is absolutely key. We need to make sure that we are communicating with our employees. They know they can speak with us when they need to. Um, and I think, as with anything in terms of, the world of employment and employer employee relationships, we don't want to be sort of snapshot, something's happened, we become aware of it, we react and we
Mm.
react harshly. Let's really just take stock and understand what's happening. Don't jump to make a decision unnecessarily or quickly that might then cause problems for us. For example, we've heard that somebody's got this second business and they're out to get us and we need to get them out immediately. We don't want to rush something unnecessarily and end up in tribunal at the back of an unfair dismissal claim, particularly when we're considering changes that are now happening with the Employment Rights Act, uncapped compensation, unfair dismissal,
Mm.
claims, etc. We need to be really careful, more careful than ever, I would say. And particularly at that senior level of employee, we just need to make sure where we are making decisions that we're doing that based on the right information and in the right way. So, yes, we might have heard whispers that somebody's setting up in competition or they're using our client database, but can we prove that? Is that right? Is that really happening? So it's about, making sure that we are taking those right steps before we jump to make any snap decisions and that we're looking at all of the options before us. At the side of that, though, there is a balancing act because
Mm.
obviously you need to protect your business and your reputation. So we don't want to linger on something too long either. So I think it's, a case of being proactive.
Mm.
So communication, proactivity, and making sure that the foundations are in place right from the start.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot to consider.
Yeah.
Obviously, we must say that not all second jobs do pose a risk.
No.
But as you've pointed out, it's making sure that you are being proactive. And if we are in the unfortunate situation where we are having to manage that situation, that we're doing everything we can in terms of investigating it and making sure that we have got the policies in place to fall back on and that people are signing contracts and more from a cultural and leadership perspective that people understand why
Yeah.
and that we're not doing it to be difficult, we're not doing it to, you know, as I said, take over people's lives.
Yeah,
There is
absolutely.
a
And I
reason
think,
for it.
yeah, I think ultimately your employees are your greatest resource. So if somebody's
Absolutely.
gone off on their own and has come up with a really great idea, is there a discussion to be had with that person to say, actually, that's a really good idea? Is there something that you can do with that person to
Mm,
bring that into the business or to really help with that,
mm,
that will help them within their role, but also that will, help to grow your business as well? We've got to appreciate that employees might have really good ideas and that can be a
absolutely.
good thing. We
Yeah.
can use that.
Mm,
And if an employee has become so frustrated that they've just thought, you know what, I'm just going to go and do this on my own, then there's a discussion to be had there
mm.
around that and what is the culture of the business, and making sure, as you say, that that communication is really there for employees and employers to really make sure they understand each other and the trust that underlines that relationship.
Thank you. If you'd like any more information on anything that we've discussed today, do feel free to visit the website and get in touch. Thanks.